Hello and welcome to a first for this podcast. We are making history today. Thank you for being part of it. Indeed, it's a first for these podcasts. Welcome to the Sources Podcast New Year Get-Together. You are listening to Whitehall Sources, or Holyrood Sources, or Stormont Sources, or Senedd Sources. And we are so glad to have you here. I'm Callum MacDonald from the Holyrood and Whitehall Sources podcast. Please take this holiday period to explore what all of our pods have to offer. You may be familiar with one or two of them. Try all four. There's plenty of time to do that. And this episode is going to help you do just that. This is a special episode for the new year, for 2026. You'll hear from your favourite hosts of the podcast you listen to the most, and you'll hear from our friends from the other podcasts that are around as well. 2026 will be yet another huge year in politics. There will be Scottish parliamentary elections, Welsh Senedd elections, and there will be local elections in councils across England. And the Sources podcasts will take you inside the politics and policy making across the country in the months ahead. So on this special New Year episode, all of our hosts are together, although from different parts of the country, to preview this year and to discuss the implications of what's happening in their patch in the year ahead. So this is the way it's going to work. We are going to go through each part of the UK. We'll focus on it, hearing what our hosts have to say and questions they want to ask of each other. We will guide you through Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland, but we're going to begin with local elections in England. Kirsty Buchanan, a former special advisor to Theresa May, and political strategist Joe Tanner are my co-hosts on the Whitehall Sources podcast. Kirsty, let's begin with local elections, shall we? They're going to be all about the rise of Reform UK and how much of a whack the Labour Party is going to take, particularly in places such as London.
Actually, I'll have to take issue with you a bit here. I think that the story of the local elections will be twofold. I don't think that the threat to Labour, and it will be considerable from Reform, just comes from the Reform side. I think increasingly we're going to see it coming from the Green Party as well. We've already seen these 5 Labour defections. I would expect that kind of trickle to pick up steadily, but also in terms of candidates being fielded and winning a lot of those seats. So I think it's probably worth just having a look at where these local elections are and where are the kind of ones to watch. So first of all, some of the mayoral contests have been postponed by Labour, just to remind people, and 9 of those shire councils, which were supposed to go to election last year, we still don't know at this stage whether they're going to go ahead either in May. That matters because those are kind of Conservative heartland, and they would be a real headache for Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative Party, because Reform are likely to make significant inroads in those. So I think we'll park those for a minute and just concentrate on, if you take out those kind of hangover shire council elections, the vast majority of these elections are urban unitary authorities, the big cities out and all of the London boroughs, right? So that matters because of all the London boroughs, I think there's about 30-odd of them. 21 of them are Labour-controlled at the moment. And I think what's going to be fascinating to watch in London is how much some of the outlying boroughs, the gains that Reform will get there, and some of the inner London boroughs, how much of a gain the Greens will get in those, and whether you're going to see the capacity for the Greens to form alliances and run councils with Labour. At this stage, I mean, who knows? 5 more months, we'll see. It seems unlikely that Greens would make such significant gains that they would actually take control, but you might have to end up with some kind of coalition between some kind of red-green alliance, and let's see how that works, because bear in mind that the Greens under Zaxpalansky are a much more kind of hard-left organisation. They're driven these days by campaigning against Labour austerity, as they see it, campaigning for Palestine, campaigning for a version of quantitative easing called modern monetary policy, which might as well be called magic money tree. So they're very much to the kind of left of the party.
Yeah.
And as much as Labour is trying to appease and move and soften the Parliament, the soft left bit of the Labour Party in its own parliamentary party handling, the Green Party is becoming a much more kind of vocal, hard left alternative to the Greens. The other areas where it's very important to look at the kind of green surge will be, I think Birmingham City Council will be absolutely fascinating. We've seen, obviously, the rise of some Gaza independent MPs. Are we going to see more quote-unquote independent Gaza councillors standing in Birmingham? How much of a toehold will they get? And then there are some of those red wall unitary authorities coming up, areas like Dudley and Kirklees, which the threat almost certainly for Labour will come from reform, and areas like Barnsley. So I think across the red wall, the issue is how much of a challenge from reform, and in the London boroughs, certainly in the inner city London boroughs and areas like Birmingham, how much of this kind of pro-Palestinian red-green alliance of Gaza independence and the Green Party, how much of that will take a chunk out of Labour's basis. And I could just leave you with one other point, which I think is a really important one, why this matters, apart from the issue about Keir Starmer's leadership. West Yorkshire Mayor Tracy Brabin was at a local government forum recently, and she said, if you lose Labour councillors, you can kiss goodbye to a second term. Because I think the important thing about local elections to bear in mind, local councillors are your activist base. They are the people that know how to campaign on the ground. Those are the people that turn out for you in an election. So it's not just Keir Starmer's future that is imperiled if Labour have a really disastrous night and lose hundreds and hundreds of Labour councillors. It's the beginning of kind of the problem in terms of holding on to a second term for Labour government as a whole.
And on that note, we'll bring in Holyrood Sources host Andy McKeever.
Kirsty and Joe, I mean, I go on quite a bit about how much the performance of the UK parties impacts what's going on at Holyrood. Is it the same in the regions? I mean, we're going to presumably see another bloodbath for Labour and the Tories in the English regions. How much of that is down to Westminster performance, and do local issues play any sort of part? Because if you look at Holyrood election results over the piece, Scottish issues don't actually play that much of a role in the performance of especially the UK parties here.
Still to be determined, because it's definitely going to have an impact in terms of their prep for those elections, because what's been happening is that the better they've performed, the money's been rolling in, it's helping to boost morale, and it's also attracting people in terms of potential candidates. The risk is that obviously they have had some challenges with some of the people that have been elected already. There have been people that they've had difficulties around their ability to do the job, whether they were appropriate to do the job. I think we had one councillor that was suspended because of the fact that he was actually employed by another council or something really obscure. There's been some weird stuff gone on. So we always said that one of the risks of having people elected was always that then their record becomes your record that then others can point to. But one of the biggest things that Reform have had on their side is that they've pretty much been electioneering for at least half of this year. They've been having these big press conferences. The events that they've been doing are almost like press conferences you'd get during an election campaign, and they have been consistently trying to set the agenda. And what's interesting is that they've been doing that against a Tory party that hasn't quite got their act together, and a Labour party, a Labour government that doesn't really know how to communicate on an average day, let alone when they've got a pretty punchy press conference coming from headed up by a Nigel Farage or Richard Tice. So I think what will be interesting is how do the other parties show up for the locals? Will they show up? Will that actually make Reform? Will it make Reform have a harder time? Will it actually put Reform under some pressure? Because actually it's easy to sort of broadcast your message and take control of the agenda by saying stuff, some of which is not always true, we know from Reform, but it's easy to kind of broadcast and get some headlines. The issue is, how do you deal with having to then interact in an election situation where your record already will be judged, and you'll have perhaps a slightly revived Tory mood because the Tories are feeling that Kemi's, she's had a few good weeks, but she's had a good few weeks at PMQs. I don't think everyone should get too excited. She's doing her job, essentially. She's, that's what she should be doing. And if you can't land some blows against Keir Starmer at the moment, then you really shouldn't be in the role at all. So I think we are in that situation of the quality of candidates is going to be one of their biggest risks. One of the biggest risks for reform. And I'm sure the other parties are going to be all over them trying to dig up dirt or find reasons that, as like the ones that have already been elected when there's been problems, this lot shouldn't be in power. So I think there's still, for me, there is still quite a long way to go, but I would certainly see that the benefits of where they've already got to will be coming through in those elections for sure.
Now to a question from David McCann, one of the hosts of the Stormont Sources podcast.
Hey everyone, great to speak to you. Now, we're keeping an eye on the rise of Reform UK here in Northern Ireland. The Reform UK TUV alliance was an electoral pact for the 2024 general election in Northern Ireland between the Reform Party and the British Unionist and kind of one of the more conservative Unionist parties we have here, the traditional Unionist Voice. The parties agreed to mutually stand candidates in 14 constituencies in Northern Ireland. So to what extent are electoral pacts essential for the survival and progress of Reform UK?
It's a very good question. Look, I think that going into the local elections, you're not going to see either Nigel Farage or Kemi Badenoch play the, we'll field here and you won't field here kind of game that we'd see in a general election, or you'd expect to see in a general election. But what you might see arising from it is a lot of NOC councils, a lot of no overall control. And it will be interesting there to see, both in, reality and going forward in the years ahead in practice, whether Reform and the Conservatives can form alliances to keep out a kind of progressive alliance. It's going to be very messy. It's not as, general elections aren't binary anymore either, but there are so many players in these fields. The numbers are so small in terms of the amount of votes that need to come out to win or lose, that it almost becomes a kind of battle of your activist base. So you'll end up, I suspect, with a lot of very confused, very muddied, lots of no overall control, and then a potential scramble for who can form an alliance and a working majority quickly enough. And for those people that can still bear to go on Twitter and want to keep abreast of top nerdery in the run-up to the local elections, there's a feed called Election Maps UK, which covers everything. It covers by-elections, it covers voting polls, etc. And it did quite recently, I think 5 days ago, it did aggregate results of the last 185 council by-elections. Now, I do sound a slight note of caution with this. I think the Greens, there's always a kind of lag in these things. I think the Greens are slightly underrepresented in terms of the surge here. But Reform are up 56 seats, Liberal Democrats are up 20, Conservatives are down 23, Labour are down 43, and the Greens are up 2. So it feels kind of, that the emphasis and the direction of travel is still very much with Reform, but I think Reform have probably plateaued. And the problem that Reform have got in local elections as opposed to others, while they do have a significant amount of councillors, they are underpowered at the moment in terms of the amount of councillors and activists that you've got. If you're a Liberal Democrat, Conservative, less so Conservative these days, or Labour or Greens. So we shall see. I think you'll end up with a lot of no overall control and a lot of unstable local government, so that it will be able to mirror our unstable national governments. Won't that be great?
And now to Joe Kiernan, one of the hosts of the Senedd Sources podcast.
Hiya, Joe, and hello, Kirsty. Now, we're one part of the country which has had a real electoral test for Reform UK, of course. We had the Caerphilly by-election in which Reform UK gave Plaid Cymru a good run, but ultimately Plaid won. The losers as much has been said about it, were Labour. Now, they trailed third place behind Plaid Cymru and Reform UK, just winning 11% of the vote. And it marks Labour's first major electoral defeat in Caerphilly for 100 years. Just wanted to ask, what sort of impact did that have on the Labour Party at Westminster, the mood there, momentum, and indeed the enthusiasm for next year's electoral challenges? And perhaps most crucially, the next round of elections in May that could potentially end the premiership of Keir Starmer.
I mean, you talk about momentum. I think the problem is that there isn't any. You know, the momentum's kind of going backwards rather than in the direction that you'd want it to go in. So if anything, it feels like it's sort of speeded up the decline, just because it probably did concentrate a few minds on fears that people were already having. I mean, the narrative has been very much around Labour having a really tough May. And so fundamentally, the challenge is that how do you sort of reverse the direction completely of the mood of the party when it's got so febrile that you're even talking in PMQs, the Prime Minister is being asked directly about whether he's how he's going to spend his last Christmas in Downing Street, and you've had a situation where even at the liaison committee, which doesn't really get political, they've gone as far as to talk about, in the job as PM, about sort of the speculation around his position. And so, and that's directly because of the concerns about what's been happening at Downing Street. So it's taken what would normally be political into a very much a sort of the running of the government and how it's impacting the government, which I thought was actually quite seismic in terms of the fact that that came up in that environment. So the reality is it's going in the wrong direction. It is making MPs very, very nervous. And let's be really clear, I think one of Keir Starmer's biggest problems is that we are all pretty much universally agreed that Keir Starmer's a good Prime Minister on the world stage and that he's been doing a pretty good job. You know, in terms of, I know Kirsty's pulling a face at that, but there is a general sense that he has done a much better job than people expected on the world stage. He's handled a lot of big occasions and some pretty tricky stuff pretty well. I actually think we're coming to the end of that period, because I think this whole challenge now that things have got a bit tougher is where I think he's had a bit of, maybe he's been riding the wave, and I think it's going to get really sticky now, because I think things in Ukraine in particular are going to become even more difficult, and this closer alignment stuff with Europe is going to start to unravel. But more than that, how do you sell that? If that is your trump card on the doorstep for a local election, Prime Minister's really good on the world stage, that's pretty difficult when you're trying to sell what it is you're actually doing for the country and what it is that is going to make a difference to your life. And I think that is where the message that Labour MPs have got to actually take out when they're going to go and canvass for in the local elections in particular. I think that's going to be really tough. And I think a lot of them are wondering, you can only stretch breakfast clubs so far as a policy win. Like it's pretty thin. The plan for change is not looking like it's really, it ever existed, let alone that it's delivering for anybody. And that's going to be pretty hard. You can get away with a few months in, you could get away roughly 9 months in, a year. It's been difficult. By the time May comes around, you should have been achieving far more.
Can I, first of all, of the good folk of Wales, take issue with the fact that Wales is not a local election? It is a Senedd election. Look, I mean, YouGov came up with some polling recently about the Senedd voting intentions, which shows that, as things currently stand, it would be a disaster both for Labour and the Conservatives. Plaid Cymru on 33%, Reform on 30%. This very much mirrors what we saw in the Caerphilly by-election. Labour on 10%, and the Conservatives on 10%. Now, if that were mirrored in a seat model, Plaid Cymru would end up with 41 seats and Reform with 33. So again, there is an interesting issue there that if Plaid end up with the majority of the seats, do they then try and form a working alliance with, and who do they form a working alliance with the Greens, with Labour? Or do they try and run a minority government? It'll all be pretty fascinating stuff. But the issue that they've got in Wales, and I think was replayed in Caerphilly and will be replayed, I think, in the Senedd elections, is that not only do you have a pretty hated Labour government in Westminster, you have a pretty hated Labour government in Cardiff Bay with, if you've got an election that is dictated by deliverism, then I think by no standards could you call the delivery of public service reform and improvement in Wales anything like a success story. Waiting lists are horrendous and routinely used as a sort of watchword in terms of their comparative performance with England. In other words, they are considerably worse. They've made some very weird economic choices in Wales and some very unpopular kind of retail decisions. And I think Labour will really, really pay the price of that. What is interesting in the difference between Senedd and Holyrood, however, is that obviously where you've got SNP, who have an equally poor public service delivery and reform track record, the hatred of the Labour government is beginning to affect the kind of toxicity of Scottish Labour, and actually could see SNP cling on to power, regardless of the fact that they've been in power for a very long time, regardless of the fact that their performance on public service reform and delivery is really poor and they're quite unpopular. John Swinney's brought them back from the kind of, harder left wokery land that they found themselves in and put them back much more in a centrist ground again. But nevertheless, I think if I was Anna Sarwar right now in Scotland, I would be kind of tearing my hair out at what should have been an absolute walkover for Labour in Scotland. And it's looking increasingly like SNP will hold on.
And to your point, Kirsty, yes, sorry, I do appreciate what the scale of the elections. The point was, the question was about the mood at Westminster. And my point about those elections in Wales is it's much more about local to them as opposed to Westminster, where that distinction is.
Kirsty Buchanan and Joe Tanner are hosts of the Whitehall Sources podcast. You will hear from them as we continue our tour around the UK. MSPs will be elected to the Scottish Parliament in May. A huge number of them are actually stepping down. Significant figures departing include two former First Ministers. They are Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf. Our hosts on the Holyrood Sources podcast are Alex Salmond's former Chief of Staff, Jeff Aberdeen, and former Communications Director for the Scottish Conservatives, Andy McKeever. Jeff, as we head into 2026, could you compare the context of these upcoming parliamentary elections for us as we begin 2026 to perhaps 2025 and 18 months ago?
Yeah, really interesting. I think at the start of 2025, despite the fact that in the polls at least, SNP had started to claw back a bit of a lead ahead of Labour, there was still a bit of optimism about Scottish Labour, I felt, in terms of the Holyrood election. I think they felt they could make a good fist of it. That was borne out during the year, of course, when they won the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. And so they will still carry some optimism, there's no doubt about that, and some hope, rather. But I think they're really starting to be punished by what's been going on at Westminster, by their Westminster colleagues. And I think it is much more hope now than optimism, actually. But the big thing that's changed for me is the solidification of the reform rise and surge. It's not risen and gone back down again. It's risen and it's sticky. And that's the big unknown quantity right now. And we are actually seeing polls showing, Reform making a strong fist of being the opposition to the SNP in May. And I reckon quietly they'll think on a good day they could perhaps run the SNP pretty close. So that's the big change for me, actually. It's the reform factor from the start of 25 to 26. It seems reform surge is really, really solidified.
Let's now take a question from one of the hosts of the Stormont Sources podcast. Here is Tim Cairns.
Thanks, Callum, and hello to all you guys from Holyrood Sources. And I just wanted to follow on from what Jeff says there. Is the rise of Reform UK and the stickiness of their support inevitable in Scotland? I mean, Jeff just explained that a little over a year ago, Scottish Labour would have been considered to be walking into power in Holyrood for the first time since 2007. But does Farage work in Scotland in the same way? They've recently had the defection of Malcolm Offord, and I heard him on your podcast a few weeks ago. Does he really align with Farage project?
Well, these are all very good questions, and the answers to them are a little bit different because of Malcolm Offord, I think, to be honest. I think the rise of an insurgent political party to challenge the SNP is inevitable. So I don't think whoever beats the SNP eventually, when it eventually happens, whether it's 2031 or 2036 or whatever it might be, I don't think that party exists yet. So no established party will beat the SNP ever, I don't think. So it will take a new party. So I suppose the question then becomes, is that new party reform? I feel like the answer to that is no. Despite Malcolm Offord, I still feel like the answer to that is no, largely not because of the message, but because of the messenger, because Nigel Farage is viewed, I think, as an English nationalist. I think it's not an unreasonable thing to view him as, because I think he probably is one. And I think for that reason, that does place a natural ceiling on reform's support in Scotland. There's no ceiling on the support for an insurgent sort of right-wing Scottish party. I think there's no ceiling on that. But I don't think it's a Scottish party with a UK base, with a London base. That actually just brings in all the same problems that the Tories and Labour and the Lib Dems have had over the last 25 years. So yes, there's space for an insurgent party. Yes, it could eventually beat the SNP. No, but I don't think it's the Reform Party.
Very briefly on that, Andy, if I may.
And that's different. Sorry, Jeff. That's different to Wales, I think, by the way. I mean, interesting to see what the Senedd Sources guys think. That is different to Wales than it is in Scotland. I think it's much easier to transfer that sort of slightly more English approach into Wales than it is into Scotland. But the Senedd guys might be shaking their head and tell me I'm an idiot. So happy for that to happen.
Well, we'll hear from our Welsh correspondents in a second. But I do want to take you on a little bit on what you say there. You say that it's not the message, it's the messenger as far as reform is concerned. But do you not believe that their message does have a ceiling in Scotland? That some of this, particularly some of the more, let's call it out for what it is, some of the xenophobic mutterings from some of the reform colleagues, particularly down south, is not having an impact on Scotland in terms of their electability?
Well, look, I think any message has a ceiling. In the SNP's message, the Labour Party, every message has a ceiling because there are political ideologies and people.
So it is the message as well.
Gather. But what I would say is though, but I think again, but on Holyrood Sources, Jeff, we've discussed this a lot over the last few weeks, including with Malcolm Offord's appearance, which is that there's what Nigel Farage and some of his people say, and there's what electors here in Scotland hear. And those are often different things. And, I just fundamentally think that people in Scotland who are voting for reform are far less interested in issues like immigration than Nigel Farage might want them to be. This is, in essence, what in the old days we would have called a protest vote. But the protest is not necessarily against a particular policy. I think the protest is against life. The protest is against the fact that people feel completely scunnered by going out to work every day and their money not going very far and feeling like Britain is not a place where hard work actually gets rewarded anymore. I mean, I think largely that is the attraction of reform. It's because there's something different, not necessarily because of what they're saying on issues like immigration.
Next, let's bring in Ollie Cole, one of the hosts of the Senedd Sources podcast.
Yes, hello Andy and hello Jeff. Now, my co-host Joe a little earlier mentioned the Cardiff-Philly by-election on the podcast, and that stands out in a bit of contrast to the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election in the summer, where Labour actually won, like you said, Jeff. And I just wondered, has any momentum that picked up for Anas Sarwar sort of dissipated, sort of gone away by this stage? Because you heard this great roar of thunder behind, Labour on the electoral run, and then it's suddenly gone a little bit quieter. You mentioned hope rather than optimism in that electoral cycle. Do you think you can get it back?
Yeah, events, dear boy, events. We don't know what we don't know in terms of what's going to happen. It's very difficult on this trajectory to see a scenario in which Labour can make a significant amount of revival or resuscitation to mount a serious challenge to the SNP and perhaps to reform as well, given what I've just said. But that said, we don't know what's going to happen with UK Labour. UK Labour is the anchor around Scottish Labour just now. It's bringing them down. If that anchor was to somewhat, for some reason, leave, go away, i.e. Keir Starmer was to depart, exit left, then perhaps there might just be a route back. But I just don't see how that can happen, and for them to have a new leader that can create a bit of groundswell in favour of Labour in advance of May. It just feels that we're running out of time for that. Never say never. Doesn't look likely.
Yeah, I think I see Caerphilly and Hamilton being quite different in that way. I'm just not convinced that Labour
different countries, I just said.
Yeah, well, there is that as well. I think they're both part of the same country, actually, Jeff. But there, that's a different story.
Depends which view you come at these things from.
There's an alarm going off somewhere.
I'm not getting involved in that debate, not on this podcast. I think Caerphilly and Hamilton are different because, well, I don't think Hamilton really gave Labour the momentum that they think it gave them. There's not really any evidence for any momentum. I mean, they had that one night, but the polls didn't particularly change. And bear in mind, they won Hamilton on a reduced vote share compared to their 2021 vote in the same constituency, which was at an all-time low. They largely won Hamilton because the SNP's vote share went down further than expected, and Labour's and Reform's went up further than expected. I mean, I don't think it really gave them any momentum. It feels to me like Caerphilly was different, because Caerphilly opened up the possibility of effectively reform being significantly hampered by centre-left, quote-unquote, progressive vote gathering around Plaid. And, the question mark then being whether or not that happens en masse at the Senedd election in May, or whether it's a by-election phenomenon. So I see them being pretty different outcomes in the grand scheme of things.
And our final question to the Holyrood Sources team comes from Joe Tanner.
So, Jeff and Andy, hello. I'm interested in what's going on in Scotland, and the fact that I think it's nearly 40 of Scotland's 129 MSPs from all parties. Almost a third have announced that they're going to be standing down before the elections in May. And is this a chance for the Scottish Parliament and its sort of representation? Is it a chance to sort of renew, or, quite frankly, which is what we saw in Westminster and we were concerned about in Westminster, seeing so many people that were standing down, is it actually a massive loss of experience, and is it potentially going to be sort of slowing down the ability to do stuff because you're going to have a lot of new people that will be elected?
There's no question it's a chance to renew its reputation. I think the reputation of the Scottish Parliament is going down all the time. I can't really complain about that. I'm a big supporter of the institution. I think it should actually have more power. But I find it really difficult to argue that it's been a success, and I find that increasingly difficult to argue that it's been a success, to be honest, because I'm not entirely convinced it has. Although I think it is a chance to renew the Parliament's reputation, I'm pretty negative about whether or not that chance will be taken, to be honest with you. There's a lot of pretty good people leaving, and then you have to look at who's coming in and say, have we got as many good people coming in as we have leaving? And look, you never know until you know, right? But I am a little bit pessimistic about what the 129 are going to look like come next May compared to what they are just now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the truth is it's an opportunity for renewal, but it's also a risk of further, perhaps, diminishing of its reputation. I think fundamental to this is something we haven't actually touched on a lot this year, as much as we should have, frankly, but there needs to be significant public sector reform. Privately, all senior politicians in all parties will tell you, we need to sort this out, but nobody's going to do it in advance of an election. I just wonder, if the cards fall a certain way post-May, will there be efforts to really significantly reform our public sector, make it much more efficient, much more effective, not without its challenges, not without its risks, I accept, but in a 5-year parliamentary term, this is the time to get it done.
Jeff Aberdeen and Andy McKeever are my co-hosts on the Holyrood Sources podcast. You'll hear more from them throughout this episode, of course, or you can subscribe right now to the podcast or YouTube channel. In Northern Ireland, the executive has gone into its Christmas break intact, which is not to be taken for granted. A couple of the Stormont Sources hosts have in fact experienced Christmas negotiations that have kept them working all through the festivities. Our hosts on Stormont Sources are David McCann and Tim Cairns, a former special advisor to the DUP First Minister Peter Robinson, alongside Michael McKernan, who worked as a special advisor when the SDLP were part of the executive. David, there's no elections in 2026 for Northern Ireland, but how stable is the executive? To what extent is it delivering in this latest mandate that it's maintaining?
Well, obviously, look, Northern Ireland is strange from other parts in that we've no guarantee of a government. The executive has not operated here for 40% of the time since 1999, so we are a wee bit unique in that respect. Look, whenever the previous collapses have happened, so the most recent ones, whether that was Sinn Féin walking out in 2017 or whether it was the DUP in 2022, they've always been over a build-up of issues. So for the DUP, it was Brexit. For Sinn Féin, obviously, it was RHI and, cultural issues around the Irish language. Though that build-up of issues is not there to the same extent. So, and the other thing is that, once Stormont comes down, really the debate always focuses then how do you get it back up? And I think because within recent memory, you have the one of the big two parties, Sinn Féin and the DUP, bringing it down. I don't see how it comes down before 2027. Now, stand to be corrected on that. I think the collapse in 2017 kind of took people by surprise, whereas the 2022 one was a bit more signposted. But at the moment, I don't see it coming down this side of May 2027. And just on the delivery piece, look, for any regular listeners to Stormont Sources, you'll hear us go on about it. It's one of the few things that the three of us have a unity ticket on. Delivery is a problem here due to lack of resource, due to a lack of priorities here. We're a four-party coalition here in Northern Ireland where we have mandatory power sharing, and trying to get things done is just so much slower. So in terms of the big reforms and big delivery, the executive hasn't really performed well as it approaches its second anniversary in office.
I think collapse is closer than you think, David. I think that the mule is loaded, the camel's back has so much resting upon
Tim,
it. I think one more straw and it could collapse. Because as you said, in 2017, who would have thought a £50,000 grant to send kids to Donegal would have brought the whole thing down? I think Irish language could bring it down. I think the redevelopment of Casement Park Stadium could bring it down. I think we could see one of those straws hit the camel's back and the whole thing could collapse before 2027. And
by the way, for everyone who maybe doesn't listen to the podcast, Tim is our resident pessimist, as nearly every member of the DUP is. Look. I think coming up to it, Tim, I don't discount what Tim says. You can never rule out a collapse. The only issue this time, Tim, is I think that if Stormont comes down, there is now more debate about if it comes down this time, that's really it. That we need to really draw a line under the power sharing experiment, that we just really cannot make this work. And then what do you move to after it? Now, we did have Hilary Benn, the Secretary of State, on our podcast a few weeks ago. And look, Hilary Benn has said he's no interest in driving the reform of Stormont process. It'll have to be the local parties. So there's no appetite from the British and Irish governments to do a deal over the heads of the local parties here. So what's the alternative? We're then left with that civil service indirect rule here, where Jane Brady, the head of the civil service, will go back to running Northern Ireland, which I just don't think...
Collapse doesn't bother me, because I think if it leads to constitutional reform, to a constitutional convention...
I agree, constitutional
I'm
reform,
all for it. And that's what Hilary Benn on our podcast pretty much said, that if it comes down, constitutional convention, we make a Stormont that can work, and then we'll get that better delivery. Well, I'm an optimist for 2027.
Well, I'm an optimist for constitutional reform, but just not the one you're looking for as well. But unionists, look, people need to be careful what they wish for, because we may at some point in the future, if it does come down and there is that stasis, you may end up getting something that does result in some form of a referendum on the constitutional future. And the last thing I would just say about the entire piece is about, where does devolution go? There's going to have to be some form of reform. Academics who've looked at this, there was Sean Haughey, who's an academic from the University of Liverpool. He talked about Lebanon, and Lebanon, for anyone who doesn't know, like 40 years ago embarked on power sharing, but they didn't actually update and reform the institutions, and that led to a lot of decay. I think we run the risk in Northern Ireland we have had some reforms to it. St Andrews Agreement 2006, and we've had New Decade, New Approach, we've had Fresh Start, we've had Stormont House, we've had quite a number of agreements. I do think we do need a more fundamental conversation before reform, but one of the reasons why we don't do that, even with the rise of the Alliance Party, whose bread and butter is reform of Stormont, is because the DP and Sinn Féin are not going to give up their vetoes, and why would they? The minute they give up their vetoes, their leverage in any negotiation is gone. So until the DP and Sinn Féin lose an election here, which doesn't seem to be likely in the near future, we're kind of stuck.
Let's turn first then to Kirsty from the Whitehall Sources podcast.
Hello, Michael, David and Tim. Lovely to finally meet you. I was listening to your brilliant interview with the Northern Ireland Secretary, Hilary Benn, last week. And you were quite rightly kind of holding him to account in terms of Westminster's relationship with Stormont. And I was struck by how reluctant he was to talk and engage about constitutional reform or a border poll in any way, shape or form. So whilst you have the enviable or perhaps unenviable, who knows, position of not having elections next year and into 2027, do you think that fundamentally the kind of relationship between Westminster and Stormont has changed? Or do you think that actually the Northern Ireland executive is still very much kind of beholden to and struggling with this kind of relationship, and the direction of travel will continue to be about greater devolution for Northern Ireland?
Well, traditionally, people think unionists and conservatives are the ones who get on well together. I mean, the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party, and traditionally it's been thought that unionists don't quite have a relationship with the Labour Party, but history has taught us that's maybe not the case. Even recent history, as you're going through Brexit, the Conservative Party, whilst the DUP were in formal coalition with them in terms of confidence and supply after the 2017 election, the Conservative Party did not address unionist needs or concerns at any point in time up until they went out of office in 2024. And in fact, many people would say that they, even though they were in formal coalition, they still did things that were not in the best interests of unionism, and we've ended up with this Irish Sea border. Traditionally, I think relationships with Labour tend to be slightly better in the unionist community. I think relationships with Labour across the piece, with Nationalists, Republicans, Unionists and others, tends to be better with the Labour Party, because I think Labour maybe gets this place slightly more than what the Conservative Party does. But that said, this new Labour government that's come in, they've had so many issues on their plate in London, in Westminster, issues at Holyrood. Can the Labour Party push the Labour Party there into government? That seems unlikely. With things that are happening in Wales, with Plaid coming up behind the Labour Party there, I think their focus has been away from Northern Ireland, and I don't think we've had quite the attention that we've got in the past. I think it's pretty clear. Hilary Benn was on the Stormont Sources podcast, as we said, and he's pretty clear. You've got your money, you've got your cash. There's going to be no more money flowing to Northern Ireland other than what we've decided is going to come. Northern Ireland politicians are saying we need more cash, we need more money, we need to get more money in here to deliver public services. But Labour's clear. You've got enough money and you're going to have to deliver with what you've got. And actually, to be honest with you, I think the Labour government's right. I think Northern Ireland does have enough money to be able to deliver public services. It's just we're ineffective at delivering the public services that we have with the money that we've been given. We need, in this next year, to cut our cloth properly and to work within our budget and to deliver services, which is going to be tough, which is going to be hard, which is going to mean things like hospitals closing. It's going to mean some rationalisation of the school estate. I suspect our politicians aren't going to be up for that before an election. But that's what they need to do. The Secretary of State is right. We've got enough money here in Northern Ireland. We've got to start delivering better.
I think that one of the issues, though, that maybe Tim isn't really kind of dealing with there is that for a long time, the British government didn't actually fund us at need. So that's only a fairly recent thing where we've got what's called the 124%. That's only came in fairly recently, and I'll give Tim's party, the DUP, credit. They were one of the big people who pressed on that in negotiations at the start of 2024 and really hammered the British government on that. Now the British government reluctantly agreed to that, but they only started it from a specific point from when the executive came back. They didn't actually give us the back pay. By the way, I always love this whenever if you go to the tax office, for example, and you find out you've been overpaying your tax, HMRC don't just give you back the tax from the moment you reported it. They give you all of it back. So, if we were underfunded in 2024, which the British government have conceded, well, then we were underfunded in the previous years as well. So we haven't got the back pay in order to deal with that, because there's a legacy of the underfunding, right? You don't just magic the health service better or the education system better. So there's tens of millions of pounds that Northern Ireland really should be getting that we're not getting. So that would be kind of more of the other angle of it. But I get it. I get that that governments are cash strapped across the UK. I get that governments are in trouble across the UK on these things, and it's not fashionable to be seen to give more money to Northern Ireland. I would also just note the following things as well, is that Hilary Benn says, yeah, look, you've got your money, you need to go. We have heard this time and time again from secretaries of state. They've all said the same thing, and yet they all end up giving more money at the end of the day. So I mean, I would just watch this space to see if Hilary Benn is any different from his many predecessors.
Yeah, I find myself agreeing with both of you. I think the money we get is substantial. We do not spend it very well. We do not manage it very well. And we've avoided the necessary transformation that would give us better value for money. But you're also right, David. There's been years and years where we haven't been getting what we should have got, and there's an argument for that being back paid. And then the other point I'd make is just on the capital side, we've been underfunded there historically and right throughout the Troubles, which has left us with a creaking and not fit for purpose water and waste infrastructure. And you could look at other areas of infrastructure where we've been historically underfunded, and that's causing us huge problems today. Not just the water and the wastewater, but things like railways. They're totally undeveloped for the modern age. So there's still a big argument to make to the Treasury for more resources.
Next to Craig, who hosts the Senedd Sources podcast.
Hello, Tim and David and Michael. I know you always take great pride in saying hello to one another on the podcast. So what I'd like to know is, has the election campaign actually started in Northern Ireland yet? How do these other elections across the UK impact on the electoral cycle there? Northern Ireland is always such an intriguing part of the political picture of the UK because of the relative instability of the Northern Ireland executive.
Well, an election campaign here is never starts too early. It is well underway now, and even though it's 17 or 18 months away, the parties are lining up, and of course the evidence is all around us. To maximise their vote, the two big parties need to get stuck into each other over traditional tribal issues, and we're having all the rows about Irish language and City Hall and just going to Israel and Gaza and so on. So the traditional tribal arguments are mounting. The parties are very focused on the opinion polls. They're very focused on the forthcoming 2027 election, and there's nothing else going to get in the way with their obsession with that. And that everything, transformation of public services, reforms, legislation, assembly agenda, all, and the executive management of the economy, all play second fiddle to consideration of the 2027 election. And they are really shaping up. In fact, they're going for it early, but they're shaping up for a really good ding-dong row that will maximise voter turnout. As for the impact of the electoral cycle in the rest of the UK or in GB, it has limited impact. I mean, the May elections next year will be of interest, and what might be of interest here is what happens with reform. Reform are expected to do well in GB. They don't really exist here at the moment, so they may appear here in some form. They may decide they don't need seats in Northern Ireland. They're going to sweep the boards in GB. But they may decide that they do want to contest Northern Ireland, and they could do that either by setting up and running themselves in Northern Ireland, or by running a proxy via the DUP or the TUV, and fight the elections that way. They while they align with the DUP and TUV on broadly issues of the Union, constitutional issues, they wouldn't see eye to eye necessarily on other areas like public expenditure and public services, where I think we would be more demanding and more pro public services, and reform would be more conservative about all that. As for other elections, local government elections, the parties here will keep an eye on elections. We're elections daft in Northern Ireland, so there will be interest. There'll be interest in any forthcoming by-elections, but the eyes are really focused here on the 2027 Assembly election.
Yeah, don't knock all the elections, Michael. Some of us make a good living out of analysing them and actually going through them all. The other thing I would just caveat with the devolved elections that are going on in Scotland and in Wales in 2026, is that I think that for nationalism here, and it is only symbolic, and I was writing about this in the Irish News, I think having 3 nationalist first ministers is going to be an important symbolic sign for the Union. I'm not saying it's going to make any press towards any kind of referendum here, but I do think that having that will be something that will that the nationalist parties will kind of hold on to when you've got Plaid leading a government in Wales, and when you've got the SNP in Scotland, and when you've also got the Sinn Féin here leading the Assembly in Northern Ireland. And the other part of this is on the reform piece. We were mentioning earlier about the Reform TUV Pact. It is worth saying that, of course, Nigel Farage came back as the leader of Reform in the middle of that general election campaign and summarily endorsed Jim Allister's rival in North Antrim, Ian Paisley, who was from the DUP, and endorsed Sammy Wilson, who is also a DUP MP, and he reneged on the agreement basically that was made between Reform and the TUV. So look, I mean, that's the other thing. Unionism and unionist parties. I mean, I don't think the relationship between Jim Allister and Nigel Farage has improved really since then, and you've got Advance UK in that mix as well, who's very close to the TV. So,
and a final one for the Stormont team. Here is Andy from the Holyrood Sources podcast.
Guys, I put out a tweet a few weeks ago, which I think you all responded to. Actually, we had a bit of a ding dong on Twitter with various different other people as well involved, really about nationalism. It was just after the Caerphilly by-election, I think it was the day after, when I mooted the point that by 2030, if the polls are correct, we'll have a nationalist government in Scotland, a Welsh nationalist government in Wales, an Irish nationalist First Minister, I know, Tim, you picked me up on that, an Irish nationalist First Minister, if not Deputy First Minister, in Northern Ireland, and an English nationalist potentially in government at Westminster, which is probably not the idea that the founding fathers of devolution had when they created it. And I think it creates a real moment for people who believe in the union to say, how do we actually hold this together? Because it could pretty quickly and easily fall apart. You know, obviously in Northern Ireland, you are more experienced probably with nationalism even than we are here in Scotland. What do you think, beyond what you said on Twitter, what do you think about that analysis and where this goes from here?
Andy, yeah, I read your tweet, which I do, with the greatest respect, showed a little bit of a lack of understanding of Northern Ireland politics, which David, in fairness, has also done in his answer to the question that Kirsty asked Michael. The First Minister of Northern Ireland is not like the First Minister in Scotland or Wales. I think that has to be said. David was a little bit fast and loose there.
I never said it wasn't, by the way.
But it is it's a joint office in Northern Ireland. And while people like David and commentators across the UK might get excited about, 3 nationalist First Ministers, in Northern Ireland, it's a joint office. And the vote for nationalism in Northern Ireland, interestingly, is not something that has increased rapidly or exponentially since 1998. The vote for nationalism has pretty much stayed fairly stagnant in that time. It's up maybe a percentage point or 2. It's not very large. Look, I mean, people will make, as David's already tried to do, and as your tweet did on Twitter a month or 2 ago, will try to make hay out of this idea that there's 3 nationalist First Ministers in some way. This is symbolic of change. I don't see it that it's going to be that way. It's one thing to vote, as you in Scotland know, for an SNP member of Parliament or an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament. It's another thing then to put your X for leaving the United Kingdom. Scotland knows that very well, and I think we in Northern Ireland are in a different position, and I think it'll be the same in Wales. I mean, look, when it's actually on paper to leave the United Kingdom, I think like us all these podcasts together. No, I know that we all know we're better off together, and we're better off in a strong United Kingdom going forward in 2026 and beyond. I think the people of Scotland know that. I think the people of Wales know that, and the people of Northern Ireland know that.
And that was a party election broadcast on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party.
No, facts, David.
Andy, now you've just got first-hand experience of what it's like to ask and manage Tim Kearns on a podcast, and my condolences to you.
Yeah, well, it'll be refreshing to have the rebels and renegades in charge all across these islands for once.
But the rebels and renegades are in charge of this podcast. That's the problem.
David McCann, Tim Cairns and Michael McKernan are your hosts on Stormont Sources every single week. The banter is off the scale, by the way, as is the political insight and analysis. For this final part of our Sources podcast get-together to see in the new year, let's turn to Wales, where there will be Senedd elections in May. Wales was the focal point of one of the biggest political moments of 2025, when Plaid Cymru won the Caerphilly by-election. Let's get straight into it with Joe Tanner from the Whitehall Sources podcast.
So, Ollie, Joe and Craig, hello. The focus on Wales was almost the sort of perfect scene set, I suppose, for the problems that are being inherited by politicians in the rest of the UK because of the performance, or pretty poor performance, I suppose we should probably call it, of the Westminster Labour government. What will be the issues that are going to decide the upcoming Welsh elections? Like, what's actually going to be the stuff that's going to make the difference? Because I know in Scotland, the Holyrood Sources podcast guys often talk about Scottish Labour needing sort of something resembling, I guess, what you'd call a win from Westminster that can be badged up as a sort of Labour success, and why it's good that we've got a Labour government as a sort of narrative for Welsh Labour. So can the same be said for Welsh Labour? Could they in the few months between now and the elections in May, is there something Starmer could do, or is it kind of a bit too late? Would it look too obvious? Is there some route to victory for Welsh Labour, that in the way that maybe in Scotland they would need a similar type win? Is there something that could be given to Welsh Labour to help them in May?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Things undoubtedly looking bleak at the moment for Welsh Labour. Every poll we've had in recent months has reinforced that, and it's definitely not helped by the slow progress of the change that was promised by Keir Starmer's government in the 2024 general election. Now, the Welsh government has been chasing what the First Minister, Senedd Morgan, has described as her shopping list, wanting control of things like the Crown Estate, policing, youth justice and fairer funding on the HS2 consequentials. So far, it's been a big fat no. I have sensed, though, in the last couple of weeks that minds are being concentrated a little at the other end of the M4. We've had the announcement on nuclear for North Wales, for example. We've had several UK cabinet ministers schmoozing with the FM at an investment summit a couple of weeks ago. Senedd Morgan has been clear that she needs a big win for Westminster, not least to help mitigate the perception that it is Plaid Cymru, in actual fact, who are the party standing up for Wales. Quite what form and whether that win will come is another matter entirely. I don't know whether you feel that's fair, Craig.
Yeah, I think all the talk of devolution of X, Y and Z, the general public will look at it as tinkering and politicking. They actually want to see something benefit their lives. So I would say some kind of infrastructure spend ultimately would be what people would see as sort of actual change in their lives. Or, let's be realistic, just an improved economic outlook across the UK is probably something that actually all parts of the Labour Party across the UK could get behind on one message.
So listening to Joe and Craig there, that's really interesting, because I wonder at this point, given the sort of UK-wide polling as well, whether Keir Starmer doing anything could sort of help Welsh Labour. I sort of wonder whether actually Keir Starmer butting out of it altogether might be more of a help in terms of the very, very short electoral cycle we've got now until May, because he and Rachel Reeves have become very, very unpopular politicians. That's not rare when you're in government. You know, people tend to want the world from you. But they are deeply unpopular, and they are in quite an important electoral cycle, whether they like it or not. So I do wonder whether there's anything that can sort of turn the tide, or whether actually, you know, Reform voters are mostly coming out against the UK government anyway, and see the Senedd government, which is run by Labour, as an extension of that. Meanwhile, Plaid Cymru are just going to hammer the UK government and say, well, you know, they're not giving enough at every corner. So I just sort of wonder whether there's anything that can be done. I suppose there's a few bits in terms of, you know, things that Senedd will have gone and asked Keir Starmer for, in terms of funding, in terms of changing slight sort of models for railways, for governance, for things like that, that he could tinker around and people could point and say, look, you know, there are some wins that Welsh Labour have got. But I do wonder whether there's really much time for any of those to sink in, and whether it might be a case of, if you're Welsh Labour, you know, we know the territory, we know the fight, stay out of it, and hopefully we can do as best as we can.
Jeff from the Holyrood Sources podcast is up next.
Well, I mentioned our Welsh correspondents earlier. Ollie, Joe, Craig, it's really good to see the Senedd Sources up and running, actually. Really enjoyed it. And there has actually always been a close connection between Scottish and Welsh politics. I remember being in Westminster when I was some years ago now, where Adam Price was there. And we would always try to forge alliances to upset the establishment parties. So I have a deep affinity with my Welsh colleagues, not just Plaid Cymru, I have to say, others as well. But Andy was considering the rise of nationalism across the UK, which, it does feel like a theme we just inevitably have to focus on in 2026. But for now, for your consideration, it's to understand what the elections in Wales mean for Labour, for the Conservatives, for Plaid, and Reform UK. So what do you see the main issues for all the parties as we lead into the elections in May?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you're seeing a rise of both Reform and Plaid Cymru. Plaid, they seem to be increasing in the polling. At the same time, Labour are just continuing to fall. That message that ultimately Plaid Cymru is the antidote, for want of a better phrase, to Reform really seems to be the thing that's cutting through, not just with Plaid Cymru voters and non-voters, but it seems a reasonable chunk of Labour voters as well. I was thinking about this the other day, actually. We've got this really interesting situation where we've got a party that's got Cymru in the name, and we've got a party that's got UK very much in their name, both topping the polls in Wales. And those two traditional parties languishing, last time we looked at like 20% of the vote between them. Do they rebuild? I would say they need to go back to what they really stand for.
Now to one of the hosts of the Stormont Sources podcast, Michael McKernan.
Yeah. Hi there, Ollie and Joe and Craig. Great to be on the podcast with you. I see your name, Joe. You can't be too far removed from the old sod here. Anyhow, I have a question just about the campaign and the election in Wales. It's for once a fascinating contest. Usually the Welsh contests are pretty much Labour dominated. This time it's pretty open, and people are expecting obviously Plaid Cymru to do very well. And Reform will be of great interest. I'm just wondering what way will the campaign run? In particular, this mixed situation, this very open election. How are the parties going to maximise their votes, either taking account of the different demographics, the urban-rural divide, North and South Wales, and even their mode of campaigning? How much of it's going to be online, or how much is going to be the old-fashioned stomping, knocking the doorsteps and so on, or how much will be media? And where do you think it's all going? Because it's frighteningly interesting.
I think it's going to be all of those things that have just been outlined. I mean, certainly the new voting system and the new constituencies that, we have in Wales mean that heaven help you if you ever thought you could knock every door in these constituencies. It would take you 4 hours in some parts of Wales to drive from one end to the other if you're stuck behind a tractor in rural areas, for example. I think that those parties like Labour that have those machines, the activists, if they can get them out, I would heavily caveat, to pound the pavements, will still do that. But I think we're going to see much more money invested on those viral campaigns online, particularly by Reform UK, because it's been working for them.
I think what will be really interesting to see is actually whether Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch actually come to Wales all that much. Realistically, they're not doing particularly well in the polls. I wonder if the parties will try to change tack. Being realistic, it worked for Reform to an extent last time. And look, I've said it time and time again, if you repeat that Caerphilly by-election result, although Reform didn't win, they still did very well and would get a lot of seats out of it. I think we'll see a continuation of that Reform campaign yet again. And from Plaid, hey, it seemed to work. It felt like it was going a bit under the radar. Why change it when it's winning?
So I've got sort of two things to mention here. First of all, picking up on the social media point, it is true that Reform and actually the Green Party have sort of dominated in that social space in the last few months, sort of UK-wide, but particularly in Wales. I mean, I don't go on Facebook that much these days, but I do find when I jump into sort of local Facebook groups or look at local Facebook advertising and what politicians and parties are doing in areas, Reform have got the money and got the people who really know how this stuff works, who really know how to sort of slap Nigel Farage's face all over everything. And similarly, Zach Polanski and the Green Party see that as something they want to do on platforms like Instagram or platforms like TikTok to sort of energise that youth vote. And we may be seeing a little bit of that in the polling that we saw just before Christmas coming out from YouGov, where the Greens are actually, clipping at the heels of Welsh Labour and the Welsh Conservatives. So that is quite interesting, and that's going to feature. It's going to get messy if they try and campaign on social media. We all remember the Brexit referendum. And they're going to use the same playbook out of Reform UK HQ and Reform Wales's HQ. You are going to have a very messy and scrappy election. And I imagine a lot of people running for office are going to find a fair few bits of abuse and caught up in the storm of a lot of things. There are a lot of questions focused at them from Reform supporters. The other thing that I think is quite interesting, though, about the campaign is a lot of it now, people are reasonably settled in where they're going to go. I mean, people either don't like Reform or they don't like Welsh Labour. So you are looking at this sort of Plaid Cymru Reform two-horse race, and people might float in between that. The real key for those parties is turning those voters into voters. Reform UK have a big challenge where a lot of their voters don't like the state and therefore may not even be signed up to vote. So first of all, they've got to get them to register to vote and then out to a polling station on the day. Whereas Plaid Cymru, from the polling we saw just before Christmas, have a lot of young people on their side. But will they find time in their day to actually go out? So there'll be a lot of campaigning, not just to say, hello, we're Plaid Cymru and here are our policies, here are our manifestos, hello, we're Reform, hello, we're Labour. It's going to be a case of, can anyone get those people out to vote? Based on Caerphilly, Plaid Cymru did a bit better, but this is a whole new voting system and a whole national field that we're looking at. So that is going to be really interesting.
So that's Ollie Cole, Joe Kiernan and Craig Lawton, the hosts of the Senedd Sources podcast, standing by to build up to the elections for the Senedd in May. There's lots to happen before then. In fact, you will want to subscribe to them right now, because coming next week is something very special on the Senedd Sources podcast. That's all I'll say. But you'll be able to hear that in about a week's time, so make sure you subscribe. Let me just say then, thank you so much for joining us for the Sources podcast's New Year get-together. 2026 is going to be a big one, a crucial one for politics, and we can say that without being able to predict the surprises that will occur along the way, it's already going to be a dramatic one. New governments will be elected in Scotland and Wales. We know that for certain. Local councils across England will also be elected in May. We could witness a change of Prime Minister. That's not off the cards. And it could happen less than 2 years since Sir Keir Starmer was elected with that huge mandate. There will be war. We hope there will be peace. There will be controversy and scandal and dispute. There will be policy announcements. There will be debates. There will be back and forth. We take you inside politics in all parts of the UK, with those who have lived it, with those who have shaped policy and debate and discussion, and those who are continuing to shape it today. There is nowhere else you need to be for the best political analysis in the crucial election year of 2026. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've had a wonderful Christmas. I hope the start to the new year has been especially happy for you. And we look forward to being with you across the Sources podcasts, Whitehall Sources, Holyrood Sources, Stormont Sources, and Senedd Sources, all throughout 2026. Find us on YouTube, subscribe on your podcast apps, and we will speak to you again very soon.